Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shamika Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love alongside my co-hosts Shamika Michelle and Wilfred Riley. And our guest this week is Tori Hope Petersen. She is a wife, foster mom, adoptive mom, and Mrs. Universe, and the author of the new book, Fostered. Tori, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me. Happy to be here.
So I wanted to talk about, obviously we're getting to your family, the book, all the other things you've done, but I like the fact that the book centers on, even though it looks at your personal experience, but talks about being fostered and what that entails and, what the system is like. And I think more people need to talk about it, and some of the things you do are bringing awareness to it. So talk about that through your book. So can we start by talking about why you wrote the book, why you felt it was important to tell your story?
Yeah, I started writing the book. It was about 3 years ago because I thought I could write something for a kid who grew up like me. I wanted to encourage them. I wanted to tell them that they were not a victim, but a victor, that they could overcome the things that had happened to them and maybe the things that they did themselves. So I wanted to write that book, and I started sharing, parts of the book that I would write on social media. And through that, I realized that there were a lot of people who wanted to help kids and families coming from hard places, who were hurt by the foster care system, who wanted to learn more about the foster care system. And through that, I learned that the book was not just for, teenagers that grew up like me. It was really for this community that cared deeply about kids who came from really hard places and wanted to do something about it.
So give us a quick summary of the book. Obviously, you're not going to go through everything. You didn't even do that in the book, but just give an idea of, kind of a quick, why you ended up there, how long you were there, and, just some of the challenges that the foster system presented for you personally.
I first went into the foster care system when I was 3 years old, and that was due to a drug bust. I was living with my mom at the time, and just months later, after I was in the foster care system, I was reunited with my mom, which is one of the purposes of the foster care system. But as I got older, my mom's mental illness got worse and the abuse in our home increased. And so I went into the foster care system again, this time with my sister, who is 10 years younger than me. And I thought that it was like an opportunity for me and my sister to escape the abuse and the chaos of our home. But within a month of being in that first home together, abuse happened in that home. Me and my sister were separated. And throughout my entire time in foster care, I moved throughout 12 homes until I emancipated the day I turned 18. And there's this myth, that kids get kicked out the day they turned 18, and that's not true anymore. There's extended foster care. You can stay in the foster care system if you want to, but I chose not to because I just felt really burned by the system and didn't really care for the bureaucracy of it.
So, Will, Shamika, you have anything you want to ask or add?
Not really right off the top. I'm interested in what Shamika has to say.
Well, so I guess I was thinking about your book, and I know a foster child that I would want to give it to, but for one, I don't even know if he can read, which is kind of just hurtful even thinking about that. And, I guess I'm wanting to know more about the system because I took a foster child in, actually someone that I was coaching at the time because I taught baton. And when social services came to look at my home to see if it was, fit for a foster child, they told me that the investigation with the family that she was living with, coming from would take 30 to 45 days. I never heard anything back from social services. When I finally called, like maybe after 60 days, I was told, oh, the case was closed, like she's with you permanently. So I ended up having her until she graduated high school, which was still only like about 2 years, but
Oh,
it just seemed like the system is just broken. And for people like on the outside that don't know anything about it, it's hard to navigate because like I felt like, okay, I'm not going to put this young lady out, but I really wasn't prepared to take an extra person in. And there was no one to really help me navigate to get her any services or any type of help, to help me, to help my children adjust to someone, coming in at that wasn't family. And so it's like,
Yeah.
something needs to be done with the system as far as just really getting that information out there. I don't know what it is, but the system definitely seems broken.
Yeah, so 50% of foster parents quit being foster parents after the first year because they don't have the support that they need. Like all of the things you're talking about that weren't there, like that's common. And so 50% of foster parents, they're just done after a year because they don't feel supported, they don't feel equipped. And what me and my husband, we are foster parents, and there's one foster care training where the caseworker was giving us a list of her emails, and she said, what if these were your emails, what would you do first? And she listed, you get a call for abuse and neglect in a biological home, you get a call of abuse or neglect in a foster home, a child breaks their leg, because then they have to do all the paperwork for that, so you have to show up in the emergency room, you get subpoenaed to court. And she just kept listing everything, and I was like, wow, like I see why all of these things end up on the back burner of like caring for the foster parent, because there are so many urgent needs within the foster care system. But right, it's cyclical because we don't take care of the caretakers, then children are not taken care of adequately, and so they're going into the foster care system and their kids are going into the foster care system, and it's happening all over again. And so we're not like fixing the root issue, which is taking care of families.
right. I think that, well, first of all, I gotta say, Shamika, I mean, how long we been doing this podcast? Every time you're on here, we learn something new. But we got to put a pin in that. But just bring that anyway. But I was gonna go. I wanted to break. I mentioned that we wanted to talk about fostering, and I wanted to break it up into two segments: the people, and then the system, because obviously the system is an issue. It has its challenges. Some are intrinsic, and some are just the nature of it being so overburdened. And then the people, every person, every piece that plays a part in that child's life has a part to play too. But since Shamika went system first, I guess we can flip it and go system first. So I've interviewed, I think I mentioned to you that I interviewed Rob Henderson about his situation, and we talked about that. He's writing a book about foster care as well, and we talked about some of the things which common sense and I knew, and some kind of surprised me. I learned more in your book. So when you talk about the system, it's kind of like when they talk about poverty or race or homelessness and everything else. Sometimes you have a point. It is, some things in the system that needs to change, but sometimes there are rules in place that are there to protect the kid and make sense. But then we have situations where no one's following them because you have too much, not enough oversight, or too many kids in the system and too much going on. So talk about some of that in the system. I think you talk about your frustrations with caseworkers, but at the same time you understand, well, they're overwhelmed and they have too many people. You talk about abuse. You just mentioned your sister and you having abuse, even trying to get away from abuse. And you would think that if the government's job is, if they're taking a kid away from the biological parent to protect them, they wouldn't put them in a place where there's abuse. And if they found out immediately, they stop it and they take the child out. But that's not always the case. And it seems so, like intentionally, mean, but sometimes it's just because they're like, well, where are we going to take them, right? And if they're going to be homeless, is that worse? And how all those things come into play. So talk about those parts of the system.
Yeah, so a huge, problem within the system is that caseworkers have too large of caseloads. Like it's one person and they're managing, it's not families that are stable. It's not families that are easy. It's families that are going through really hard things. And, there's a child And then that child now has two families. So the caseworker is managing two families for every child, the foster family or the adoptive family, as well as the biological family. And that's a lot. People say, okay, a caseworker might have 50 children on their caseload, but if you think of it, that's 100 families to manage.
Right.
So I think that that's a huge issue, is just caseworkers being overworked. And in 2016, I worked for Steve Scalise and the Congressional Coalition on Adoption Institute, and I wrote a policy presented to Congress about how CASAs, they're called court-appointed special advocates, it's a volunteer position, or GALs in some states, which is guardian ad litem, that they should be responsible for investigations for like abuse, neglect that happened in foster homes, because the job of the CASA and the GAL, their job description is to advocate for what's in the best interest of the child. And if you look at the caseworker's job, even though caseworkers, they have a good heart to get into it, they might have good intention, they're still working for the state, they're working for the government, and they have to reach these mandates and they have these requirements. And so in advocating, they might want to advocate for what's in the best interest of the child, but they also have to do what's in the best interest of the state. And sometimes that's a conflict of interest. But if you have a CASA or a guardian ad litem investigating cases of abuse and neglect and being more involved in the child's case, there's literally no conflict of interest because they advocate and they work for the child directly.
And one other thing, and I'll let them get back in there. Another part of the system, you talk about advocating for the child, and these children are removed from their homes because something happened, right? Some types of abuse or something. So, you know, in many cases, the biological parent is trying to fix that situation, get the child back. But in some situations, the system is not really set up in a way that kind of encourages that situation, right? It's not doing anything to help that biological parent get better. It's not doing anything to say, well, it's the child's best interest to be where they are or to fix that situation. It's just like, you know, maybe they'll give them a little leeway before they take the child away. But once they take the child away, they act as if they put a wall up and they don't care what happens to that parent. So what part of the system is damaged because of the relationship the government plays with the biological parent?
Yeah, so in my situation, when I grew up in the foster care system, it was never a possibility for me to go back with my mom. I never should have, like, you know, that never should have been an option. But reunification is a beautiful thing. And my husband and I, we actually took in a biological mom who was working to get her kids out of the foster care system. And she lived with us for some time, and we were helping her trying to get stable and until she got her own apartment. But I remember, you know, trying to help her work through her case plan, and she showed me the paper, and I was like, I don't know if I would be able to do this. Like, it was just wildly hard. And, you know, she's just coming from such a hard place. Like, she grew up in such a hard place. And then she has this wildly hard case plan, and she has all the heart to love her children and get them back. But there are, like, right, a lot of walls, like you said, that are put up, and not a lot of help. But there's an imbalance in the foster care system of, yes, we need to offer foster parents more support so they don't quit after the first year, but it's becoming a bit of an imbalance where foster and adoptive parents are helped so much that we forget about the biological parents and forget that it's a possibility for children to go back and be with their biological families.
Well, Shamika?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a lot of stuff there. The foster care system isn't really something that I'm an expert in at all, to be honest. I'm mostly just listening. But I mean, you do notice that if you've ever known anyone in government service, that problem of overburdening is real. I mean, it's the same thing in the law. I mean, I trained as a lawyer, and my one piece of advice to anyone, especially a young man charged with a crime, is get a private, quote unquote, pay lawyer. If you get a public defender, they're going to have, I think the average is 170 cases on their docket. So, and these are very well-intentioned people. I do think this is true. When you talk to social workers, PDs, prosecutors, they're not sort of bums on the government dime, but there's only so much you can do. I mean, in private practice, the biggest caseload I've ever seen is, I think, 4. And that's pretty good when you consider that's 4 paying cases at one time. So, I mean, that's something, it's interesting to hear that that's the case in foster care as well. I'm not at all surprised. So you probably end up doing sort of a very perfunctory check for the most basic things. Do we notice abuse in this home? I mean, there's got to be a checklist there. The one question that I have that I wrote down, sort of taking notes here, and I've asked public defenders the same thing, but a lot of these governmental systems, because there's not a profit incentive the way there is for us in business, you kind of question what the overall goal of the system is. So, I mean, when you said that for a lot of families, reconciliation, reunification, that's not really reasonable. Someone might be addicted to crack or crystal meth or something like that. What should the goal of the foster care system be? I mean, is it to get kids back with their parents, which seems to be, from the material I've read, what is still promoted most often? Or is it just best interest of the child? You do whatever you need to help the kid. Like, what do you think they should really be focused on?
Yeah, so if you would ask the foster care system like what their focus is on, they usually say reunification or
Yeah.
kinship. It's definitely focused on biological families. I say that the foster care system's purpose should be to make families whole and to make families healed. And that could be through reunification. It could be through kinship. My husband and I are kinship providers. My sister, my biological sister, who I was separated from, now lives with me full time. So I am for these things. But the reality is that can't always be the case, because usually if one parent or one family member is experiencing trauma or drug abuse, it's generational. It's a generational curse, a generational stronghold. And so that's when we have to look at foster care or adoption. And I think that at this time, the government they're really honing in on biological and kinship placements right now to keep children out of residential homes, group homes, which are kind of like America's modern day orphanages. And that's a good thing. But I also think that we can't count out foster care and adoption, because the whole goal should just be to make families whole and healed.
Yeah, no, it's good to hear you say that. I mean, my goal is just a competent leader from a totally different field would be kind of to help the kids as much as possible. Reunification, just thinking objectively about this, seems like it would often end in severe tragedy. I mean, if someone's mother or father is a persistent drug abuser and, sex work or something gets tied into that, if they quote unquote get better and you give the kid back, you don't want to be cynical, but you kind of know what's going to happen. And having worked with government agencies, I find that there often are these set rules that someone argued for kind of a couple decades ago that are just in the process. I mean, in adoption, for example, there's still racial preferences. At least in most of the states I've lived in, there's a preference for placing kids with adoptive parents of the same race. And I don't see any logical basis for that at all in 2022. But if you're saying, well, that's what the rules are, mom is off the pipe for a couple months, so the kid is returning, you can see how that's going to cause consistent recurring trauma for those kids. So there's not really a point there. That's just
Right.
unfortunate. And hopefully something that, advocates like yourself can kind of work through or change. So,
Well, one of the things I see that's weird is the weird that government does worst is the weird combination of what you just mentioned, Will. If they said the goal was to get the kids back to the biological parents, there are times where that's good and there's times where they're bad. If they say the goal is to do what's best for the kid, obviously that's good, but it can mean many things. What I find is sometimes there are situations when the parent has turned their life around and they're trying to get the kid back, and there's the wall I talked about, so they're getting blocked out, like you talked about, this paperwork that they can't do. They make it the obstacle so hard, but then when the parents shouldn't be getting the kid back, they do. And a perfect segue is Tori mentions in her book a point where she had an issue at a foster home and she needed out. The caseworker's like, we don't have anywhere to go. And by law, by the rules, she could not be with her mom. But who did they call, Tori? They called her mom.
They call my mom. Yep. And I think that it was just like, we don't know where to what to do. We don't know where to put her.
Right.
And so, yeah, they would just call my mom. And I think that, it goes back to caseworkers have too big of a caseload. They have too much to do. And so, like, right, what happened to you is what happened to me and what happened to my mom. They just like throw things on us that shouldn't be thrown on us and that we're not prepared for.
Right. Shamika.
So my question is like for someone that takes in a child, like thankfully this young lady that I took in wasn't like problematic. But since Charles says this is something he didn't know about
Oh
me.
God.
So she's 29. I also took in a young man who's now 26. But when it was time for his brother, who was younger than him, looking for a place to stay, I was like, absolutely not, because I just felt like he was going to be extremely problematic. And again, I said I didn't get any real assistance for her. What do you say to a person who wants to, like, what are the resources to reach out for someone that may need like extensive counseling or, healing outside of, like church, something that may be more professional, because it's a really scary thought when you're bringing people into your home and you already have children, or, you don't want to, you see such horror stories where kids have, killed their parents or killed their siblings. And what are the resources to actually provide therapy when families do this, because it's a big deal.
Yeah, so there are things like residential treatment centers, and group homes, which offer children who have experiences like that or who have struggles like that, treatment, and help. But if you, like, say you were taking in a child that was having struggles, that's why the foster care system, if you are a part of a good agency, something that I encourage people to do if they're interested in being in foster care is to go to a small agency. I say don't go through the state. Go through like a nonprofit. So there's foster care agencies that are nonprofits, and in my experience, the best ones are Christian agencies. And they're just small, they're more helpful, and they have resources like the things that you're asking. Like they have counseling and therapy that they can offer youth. And when youth are in the foster care system, all that is covered so that it doesn't fall back on the foster parent or the caregiver.
Yeah, I think I'm too old now, but for somebody else, I can let them know.
Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of stigmas and stereotypes that are placed on youth in foster care because of the statistics that have plagued them and because of what they've been through. And something that I just encourage people to do is to just get involved. If we can see these children as God sees them, not as troubled children, but as children of God, then that will kind of force us to get more involved, because when we ask God to break our heart for what breaks his heart, then we become closer to the problem or to the person. And we grow in compassion, and that's what heals people is connection and relationship. My track coach came into my life my between my junior year and senior year of high school, and I built like a really strong relationship with him. I was like searching for a father figure, really wanted acceptance, wanted love. He came into my life, and like everyone told him, like, do not, like, don't mess with this girl. Like, she is trouble. They were like, wash your hands of her. She's gonna get you in trouble. And he just like kind of shrugged his shoulders and was like, yeah, whatever. And he became like my dad. And he's the man who took me in. And he's the man who my kids call grandpa today. I've spent every Christmas with him since. He walked me down the aisle at my wedding. And right, that's because like he chose to see me differently. And now I know that there are youth who have serious problems who do need treatment and help. But I think too that sometimes we just need to see kids differently and help them see themselves differently, in a way that heals them so that they don't have those struggles as deeply.
Now, with all of the trauma that you suffered, the beatings and the abuse, what would you say exactly, like, what was the first steps for you to get healing? Like this man, and he took you in, and then what?
Well, before that, I did go to a residential treatment facility or like a group home. And I was like, I do not belong here. I was very angry that I was there. I thought that I was better than all the girls. but I was put in counseling, and it was court mandated that I attended therapy. And of course, I was like, I don't need this. This is silly. But I realized, as I got older and more mature, that time, as I was going through therapy, really helped me understand how to process my emotions, how to process my trauma, how to work through it. And I could more easily identify my trauma to work through it when it came back up, say when I was in college or in my adulthood. And so I feel very fortunate that I was forced to go to therapy when I started when I was like 12. And I think that a lot of parents, a lot of caseworkers, they don't mandate it. I've actually never heard of a judge mandating another child going into therapy, and I don't know why, because it was one of the best things that ever happened to me. And then when people did come into my life, I think because of the therapy and because of the treatment, then when people did come into my life, I didn't just sabotage and ruin every relationship, which I think is a huge struggle with youth in foster care, not because they're evil, but because they haven't learned the trauma that they've gone through. They haven't learned that not all people are bad and not all people are going to hurt them.
That was going to be my next question, because the young man that I was speaking of, that I was like, absolutely not, I'm not willing to. His grandfather did take him in. Now he's 19 though, and even though the door is still open for him to be there, he doesn't want to be there. He didn't want to follow any rules. He didn't want to get a job. He didn't want to do anything. He wanted to just kind of like be on the streets. Well, it's almost been 2 weeks now, he was shot. And it's like, why would you choose that life over being somewhere safe with family? And, he has been in the system like most of his entire life, in and out of group homes, in and out of foster homes. And like, it's hard for me to wrap my brain around, like, why would you not want to be with family? But just hearing what you just said about not trusting people, I guess that kind of, answers that question.
A lot of
Yeah.
it also, just a quick jump in, is knowing how to do things. Like the example that always comes to my mind is just basic stuff like applying for a job. Like when I was a kid, my dad wasn't there, and I'm a hustler, I guess. I mean, like when I first started looking for work, I literally just biked to the nearest mall and asked people what I would need to do to get a job. And I was an athlete in the community. I wasn't disliked. I ended up working at like Foot Locker or something. But like over the years, I learned about other things. Like there are job ads, classified ads in newspapers. Some of this stuff is now online. There are different ways you can do this. I didn't understand anything about that process. I just sort of wanted to work. So I wound up, selling shoes or doing construction or something. But without more knowledge, without more learning, which, like Tori said, mostly came from male figures in my life, coaches and that kind of thing, I wouldn't have picked up that knowledge. So if you're a kid and you come from kind of a street background, or you come from a group home background, and you're in the house of kind of a tough older, especially male relative, and they're saying, like, this is the chore rota, you're going to be doing this, this is when we go to church. I mean, that stuff, it's a whole series of things that you have to be willing to admit you don't know how to do, and willing to be taught, sort of. Another aspect of this also is that the streets are fun. I mean, like, I was never a gang type of guy, but I was a rave and skater kid in Chicago when I was like 13 or 14. Like, it's fun to hook up at that age of your life. It's fun to sit around all outside smoking weed as opposed to going to school. So there are two different things. One, you have to admit, and this can be very hard for a tough young person, that you don't know how to do basic things like work, tie a tie, get dressed, do chores with other people, get along with other people, admit when you're afraid. That's a big one. So on down the line. But level two also is that if you choose not to do that, you just sit on the corner and drink a 40. And there's something to be said for that when you're 16. The problem is that there's not much of a retirement plan in that. But yeah, like the more hard hit, the more traumatized you are as a young person, the more work it's going to take. It's not that it can't happen, but the more work it's going to take to pull you up. Right. Someone has to be willing to invest that amount of time, whether that's a parent, whether that's a coach, that's a spiritual figure, but it's going to have to be somebody. And I'll say one kind of left-wing thing here, like just saying like, oh, those black people, those poor whites or whatever the group is, why don't they study more? motherfucker, because they don't know how to study, like, because that's a learned skill, flashcards, all that stuff. You have to learn how to do that. The
Let's
question is,
go.
who's going to be the teacher?
That's so good. That's so good,
Yeah.
right? Because we tell people like you need to pick yourself up by the bootstraps. And it's like, but what if they don't have boots? Like, then what do they do? And I think, people ask me, how do I help youth in foster care? How do I help kids from hard places? The number one thing I say is you have to give them opportunity. Because in the foster care system, and this is like why another reason why kids want to leave is because in the foster care system, you can't do anything. Like there are all these rules. You got to stay home. You can't go anywhere. You can't even have a job. And so what foster youth need, or what kids from hard places need, is they need to be shown how to do things so that they can like see their future of like, oh, I can have a job, or oh, I can be good at this, and like, oh, there is a purpose and there's a plan for me, and I have talents and I have gifts. Because if they don't ever even, if they're not even given the opportunity, then they're not gonna be able to see that.
Absolutely. And this is, I noticed this is becoming a thing where you have almost brands, although I know and like both of these people, but like New Emerging King or Dad Does, where they have this, I mean, they do serious things like run schools too, but there's also this whole series of lessons on platforms like YouTube, like this is how you do X, this is how you do basic maintenance on a car, just stuff that you would have no idea how to do if you're like, there's so much that I didn't, I grew up in a single mom family. It wasn't the classic hood experience. I mean, my mom's family was pretty rich. She just stopped talking to him. So we lived in the hood for most of my early life. But I mean, there was so much stuff that I realized later in life that quote unquote normal people just learned through kind of osmosis, like just doing with their families. Like I didn't know that the clothes were seasonal in stores until I was like 17 or 18. Because, and I don't mean to say this cynically, like I lived in the worst neighborhood ever, my friends mostly bought them from thieves. I mean, this was during like the low lifes era in Chicago where people would take racks of clothing out of stores and go to working class neighborhoods and sell it. I mean, go to thrift stores. Like the whole idea of there's this cycle, like it's sweater season now. I didn't understand those references people were making in television shows until I was nearly a grown man. And in fact, at the time, I was working in a clothing store. That's how I picked it up. But everything that you think you just automatically know, the basic maintenance I can do on a vehicle, how to shoot a firearm, somebody taught you that.
Yeah. When I did my internship on the Hill, it's so funny because I'm just like, I'm here and like I've made it and I'm going to be so good at this. And then like I'm in these places where everyone's wearing suits and nice dresses and I'm like, I am very uncomfortable. And then the place that I was interning for, they had me take an etiquette class.
Yep,
and that sounds so silly, but like I was eating with congressmen and women and people from the White House, and like I didn't know what fork was for what or why there was a big plate and a small plate. And I, not kidding you, I would drink my water and I would hold it in my cheeks. And like I know that that's so silly and it's obvious to people that you should not drink water and hold it in your cheeks in front of a congressman, but to me it's just what I did. And when I took that etiquette class, I mean it was just like, it was so eye-opening to me, like these little things matter. And it's not because like people are like, oh, these people don't want you to be who you are, and it's like, no, like we should have high standards. They matter. And if we care about the people coming after us and we want to advocate for them and change things for them, then we need to do these little things that matter to the important people sitting across from us.
Well, that's important too, because I talked about the system and the other side being the people, and part of that is some of the things you've gone through, you talked about in your book, but just generally you think about it. If you took some time to think about the foster care system, there are people, obviously that affect the kid, the reason the situation happened. We talk about the abuse without going into, biological parents. And obviously we beat up on the system. It's like the system should be better, which it should, but we don't say, well, it's not like a business. Like Will uses a lot of business references, right? So it's not like a business where you can kind of, do your metrics and base it on last year and get an idea and say, okay, how many widgets are we going to need? Because we can predict how many parents are going to, get off their meds when they have mental health issues, or try to traffic their kid or do these really heinous things. So the parents have a part to play too, and the family. You talk about some of this is generational. So, in some cases, you used to have an issue with mom, you go stay with your grandmother, you go stay with your aunt. But if the family is all dysfunctional, that's a problem. And then you talk about the foster parents themselves. Why, like Shamika was an upright citizen trying to help, but some of the people do it because they want money, or worse yet, some of them, you had situations where people present it well, right, and they look like the perfect foster parents, but then they're doing all these other things, or they're mistreating the kids, or they're like strict disciplinarians, and if you don't follow the rule, we're going to do all these other things, and then the caseworker doesn't have time to see what's going on. The kid complains. When they do get up the courage to complain, they don't believe them, right? Because come on, this is Mrs. Johnson. Everybody knows Mrs. Johnson. They're nice. So then you have that issue where they don't do anything, and then you have the other side, right? So you got the ones like you described being in a group home as like being an Annie, with where all these beds line up and that kind of deal. But then you have the other ones, the ones who want to, maybe it's a replacement. They couldn't have kids and they want to have kids, so they just shower them, right, with these gifts. And when I was at Hillsdale and you weren't there, so I didn't get to see you again, but I met a group of people who ran a foster care facility out west. And they were saying that, this really cool thing they do to help the biological parents when they get them together at Christmas, they help them get these gifts. So they would buy these gifts, they would donate them, and they put them in a store and let the kids and the biological mom go with them to pick out stuff and buy it, even though it was already there. So it looks like their parents bought them, wrapped them the gift, as opposed to buying them a bunch of gifts or doing anything, fancy clothes or whatever they do, and taking away their agency because they don't think they have to earn anything, or they resent it, right? So there's all these things that the people do outside of the system that makes it more difficult for the foster kids too, right?
Oh yeah. This is like the hill that I will die on because it drives me insane. There are so many nonprofits that they just give and give and give these material things. There's a young man in my small town that he lives in his apartment for free. He experienced the foster care system, aged out of the foster care system, lives in his apartment for free, doesn't pay like his utilities, and like the rules are that he has to have a job. But he can, if he loses his job for some reason, he has a month then that he can regain the job. To me, that is just like too long because like
you hard.
He just like gets a job for a week.
Yep.
And then he waits another month to get a job. And so he doesn't work more than he does not work more than he works, right, because there's not a motivation to work when everything is given to you, when everything is paid for. And he learned that, likely you learn that when you're in the foster care system, because there is so many, like, you just get material things donated. You're, as a foster kid, you really are just given so much. I remember I spent a Christmas with, and this like will show how entitled I was as a person in foster care. I was a kid. I went into foster care system 2 days before Christmas, and the person who, she was like my youth leader. She didn't want me and my sister to go into the foster care system like 2 days before Christmas. She was like, well, she can spend Christmas with us. So we went with her, and she got us all these presents, and we had more presents than her kids combined. There were so many. And I opened all the presents on Christmas Day, and I asked her if we could go return them to Walmart. I know, for like gift cards and money, because it was just such a normal thing to see youth in foster care like just get what they wanted and to get these crazy gifts. And I now know youth who have aged out, and they kind of expect, when they go through a tragedy in life or when they need something, they can just go to a nonprofit and ask for it. I think that in a sense, it is helpful because, those youth do start behind. But it can also be detrimental because it's not showing people that they have to work and that they are capable of overcoming and doing hard things.
Wow. Now, I got a question about the book specifically. So you talk about some hard things to the point that the book opens with a disclaimer, like if you don't want to read this, I'm letting you know now, don't read it. But obviously, it's just little vignettes. It's not your whole life, right? So how did you determine how much to put in the book? You know, and did you end up putting more in the book than you planned or less than you planned?
So when I started writing, I how I started writing, I read books, like The Art of Memoir, and I read books about writing. So one of the things to be, because I wanted to be a good writer. And so one of the things that I read was to just write, and then you go back and edit. Kind of like the idea of what people say, like write drunk, edit sober. That's not what I did, but that was kind of my mentality. Like I'm just gonna write like crazy, and then we'll go back and clean it up. And so I wrote, and then I would go back and I would read my stories, and I would say, is this a story that can actually serve people? Does it have purpose? Can someone learn from it? Or is it just like, some of the things that I left out, they were just like really, they were just like these stories that embellished the book because what happened to me was terrible. And I didn't want to just embellish the book and to people just to read it and be like, I guess like it entertained by some of the worst things that happened to me. I really wanted it to be a book that educated people, that served people, and that changed people's hearts. So every story in there, I asked myself that: can this change a person's heart? Can this serve them? Is this book going to make the reader better?
Got you. Yeah. So, I mean, I think it was enough to give people a really good idea to different situations, to moving around, that kind of thing. I think one thing that's not covered enough, and I think it's probably because of what you wanted them to see, right? You wanted them to understand, get a good idea of what, I mean, it's called Foster. That's like, but so there's some dark stuff in it, right? But I don't think it's enough. I mean, you achieved some things in that time, right? I mean, it had to be hard to graduate high school when you're moving around all these things. Had a good GPA, it failed because you missed school for a while, then it goes back up. You know, you got into track, you talk about that and winning, but to do, I mean, people would have to think that you did that while all this other stuff was going on, right? And just, how you were able to do that. And you talk about some of the people, you talk about the coach, and then you talk about some of the foster parents that were a little better than the other. You talked about Gigi, you talk about some other people, but obviously that had to be, you mentioned one other teacher, but people along the way that that helped, you talk about your relationship with God and how your faith grew and you had some doubt and those kind of things. But there had to be some other people in your life that were there that aren't mentioned in the book, but had an impact from whether it's just education, a friend that helped you out. I'm gonna give you one, Shamika. How about this? So we had Seth on. I'm sorry, we had Noah Smith on a couple of weeks ago, and Will and him went back and forth about what he do. It's like, well, it's really hard if you were homeless, right, to get out of it. And Will's like, well, there's something I would do. I don't know why I didn't think about it until then, but reading the book, I thought about it. So I was homeless, right, and I did the exact same thing Will said do. I was like, all right, I had a car though, right? So I had a car and a car note. When I lost my place, had no, but so I went and got a job at McDonald's, right? And I just saved all the money, didn't pay the car note, had no utilities, right? So I was just gonna hoard this money until I found out what I would do. And then the car got repoed, because I wasn't paying the car note. So then it got a little bit more complicated. Right, but you end up finding somebody who will help you. I remember the one thing I do remember, so weird. So I had a friend that was in college and I went to visit him, but I didn't tell him I didn't have a place to stay. But I think back at how he looked at me when he fed me, like something's wrong with this dude, right? So you have these people that you just go and they don't really judge you. They don't ask you a lot of questions. They give you what you need at that time, and then you move on to the next place. And then eventually, I ended up getting a job that paid a little bit more, and then I bought a clunker, drove around in that until met a woman, paid some rent, moved in together, made some more money, and I went back and got a degree and associate degree so I can go to work and then work my way through college. but that's what I did. But there were people you think about, yeah, I did this on my own, but you're like, yeah, that was that guy who did this, or the person let me stay there for a week. So that things like that, Tori. Obviously that didn't make the book, but do you think of people, other foster kids that you met, or other people who helped you along the way that you didn't think about when you were in it?
Yes, I see, especially because of my job now. So my full-time job now, what I do is I come along churches and nonprofit and different institutions, and I help them build programs for underserved communities, and I'm a public speaker. And I write, but like the biggest part of my job is public speaking and then partnering with people. And so I was a part of a church that my foster mom was taking me to, Gigi, who you mentioned, and they spoke so much life over me. Like they just told me, like, you're anointed, you're appointed, you are called to do great things. And I like didn't know what any of that meant. I was just like, okay, that's nice. But I see that they were planting these seeds, and then they would give me opportunities. Like I was a very young believer, and I think that there are maybe pastors and people in ministry who would think that the ministers who were over me maybe were irresponsible because they like asked me to share my testimony. They asked me to do advocacy alongside of them, and I just did it because I was like, yeah, like whatever God wants me to do, I'm just going to say yes to. And it was very innocent. But I see now that they saw something in me that I did not see in myself that I now am. But it was really them, like we talked about, giving me these opportunities to show me who God created me to be. And I had no idea what they were doing. And I didn't really understand that until maybe like 2 years ago, that they were really planting seeds for what is now.
Well, I want to ask you one last thing, and that Will and Shamika say anything they want to say before we finish up. But it just was an odd turn. So, Mrs. Universe, I really just all of a sudden, all this, I'm gonna go join a pageant.
Yes, that's kind of exactly how it was. I love that you think it's funny
mean
because
you weren't
I also,
you
it
telling me
really
you
is
weren't
funny.
secretly planning to, practicing pageants when you were 9, 10, 11, and this just all came out when you got older?
No,
Okay.
no, no. So my husband and I were fostering a sibling group of three. They were 3, 2, and 1, and we have our 2 biological children. And so we had 5 kids, 3 and under. And everyone's like, "Oh my gosh, that's amazing!" And it's like, no, it's the stupidest thing I've ever done. Like it was such.
And how old are you at the time?
I was 25.
Right. Okay.
Terrible. It
Don't
was
forget to tell
a
people that.
terrible idea. Like we had like a set of triplets and a set of twins, basically.
Right.
And then we were in the process of adopting our young adult. And so it was just like bad idea. And I was drained. I was in like my mom's sweatpants and mom bun every day. And then someone presented the opportunity of pageantry, and I was like, wow, that sounds so fun. because it was so different than like
Outside of the
what I was
house,
doing.
it's glamorous.
And I know the
outside
other
of the
women hate her,
house.
Will, because she was like, I just did it because I had all these kids around. Like, I should do something. And she won.
Yeah. Yeah. It was
Just
silly.
something, a reason to take off the sweatpants. That was it.
Yeah, it was a reason. I was like, I just want to get pretty. Like I'm done with these sweatpants. And
Wow.
it was really fun. What I like to say is that I'm the same person I was before and the same person I was after this title. I was doing the same work. But I I'm so thankful for the title of Mrs. Universe because people started to take me way seriously. Like I was 22 when I started doing this work. So that was 4 years ago. I'm 26 now. And when I started speaking, I really do think that people were looking at me like, who is this 22-year-old telling me like about God and these things to do with my foster children? And now I have this title and people are like, wow, I'm just going to listen to her. And
You
so
like sucker. I'm sorry, Lisa.
yeah, right. I'm like, yeah, I totally suckered you into listening to me. But I'm really thankful for it. But at the same time, I think it's a caution, right, to what we look to in society, because like I'm the same person doing the same stuff, but I think it kind of reveals what we value.
Well, when I met you, you did come off kind of pageantish, and I didn't want to say anything, but You know, when you were just telling me to fetch you stuff, I thought that was odd, but then I realized why. But Will, Shamika, anything you want to ask before we close with her beloved initiative? So,
No, not really.
no,
Well, Charles, my comment is to you.
you can't. I'm not the
Yeah.
guest.
Now, I ain't saying I'm a gold digger, but I ain't know I was podcasting with a former broke nigga.
At least you said former. I mean, I got a couple nickels to run together now.
I mean, goodness. I didn't see. We've been doing this how long? I never
See?
knew you were
You always throwing
homeless,
stuff.
you know?
I do. You know, that made me think about my brother. So I got to call my brother because he lost the car I had. I'm broke. I finally get a car. It's an old orange station wagon. It's the only one door open, the driver door. You had to walk around. The other door didn't work, and he needed to go put something in the back. I let him use the car, and then he's like, he lost it. I still don't own my
Oh my
car. I want my
God.
car
You
back.
lost it.
Yeah, he lost my car.
Hard to lose a car.
Yeah.
An
You gotta
orange
talk about that
station
one.
wagon. Orange station wagon.
Yeah,
And he
that's
lost it.
crazy.
See, now I'm triggered, and you're reopening wounds.
Yeah.
Tori, talk about, let's end on a positive note. Talk about what the things you do with Hillsdale. Talk about Beloved Initiative. Tell us how people can, learn more about what you're doing and help out in any way.
Yes, the Beloved Initiative is a 501c3 nonprofit that I founded, and we serve youth who have experienced the foster care system, so adults usually that have experienced the foster care system, human trafficking survivors, and people who have experienced egregious abuse. And we help them tell their stories so that they know that they can see, like when we see the power of our stories, that's when we see that we're victors, that we can overcome, that we're not victims. And so we help people tell their stories. This week, I'm hosting a retreat, and 13 survivors from all over the nation are coming. We're bringing in speakers, and they're going to learn how do you publicly speak and walk away feeling dignified and not re-traumatized. And then I also work for Hillsdale College, and I have the honor of working alongside them to build a program to serve underserved communities and people who just come from hard places.
That is awesome. That retreat sounds amazing, and obviously the things you give some of these kids money to go to school and help them out in any way they can is really important. I appreciate you, and in spite of our initial meeting, it's good to know that you're a normal person, and I will look at you in a different way now. She is Tori Hope Petersen, former foster child and Mrs. Universe, author of Foster. Pick up the book. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I got a country to say, God bless the US of A, land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to say, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving the day.